Sometimes the people we judge harshest are the ones who change our lives forever. Sarah Martinez never thought a single moment of anger would rewrite her entire future. But on a cold Tuesday morning at Columbia University, her world was about to shift in ways she couldn't imagine. Sarah wasn't like the other students walking across campus that day. While they carried designer bags and wore clothes that cost more than her family's monthly rent, she clutched a worn backpack and kept her head down. Her father, Miguel, had been the night janitor at Columbia for 15 years. Every scholarship, dollar, every late-night study session, every sacrifice her family made was so Sarah could walk these halls as a student, not just the janitor's daughter. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders every single day. She couldn't afford to fail, couldn't afford to be anything less than perfect. While other students partied and complained about cafeteria food, Sarah worked double shifts at the campus coffee shop and ate ramen noodles for dinner. Her grades had to be flawless because there was no safety net, no family fortune to fall back on if things went wrong. That morning started like any other. Sarah rushed across the quad, late for her advanced literature class. Professor Williams had a reputation for locking out tardy students, and Sarah couldn't afford to miss another lecture. Her scholarship depended on perfect attendance and grades that most students only dreamed of achieving. As she hurried past the fountain, something caught her eye that made her blood run cold. A man sat on the stone ledge, expensive camera in hand, taking photos of the morning light filtering through the autumn leaves. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with salt and pepper hair and clothes that screamed money. Everything about him radiated the kind of privilege that Sarah had learned to both envy and despise. But what made Sarah's anger boil over wasn't his obvious wealth. It was what he was photographing, and more importantly, what he was ignoring. Behind him, barely visible in his carefully composed shots, was her father. Miguel pushed his cleaning cart across the courtyard, collecting trash that these privileged students carelessly dropped. The contrast was stark and painful. The beautiful campus bathed in golden light, and her father, invisible to most, doing the back-breaking work that kept this place pristine. The photographer adjusted his lens, clearly trying to capture the perfect shot of authentic campus life, while completely overlooking the human being who made it possible. Sarah had seen this before. Rich tourists who came to photograph the prestigious university, treating her father and other staff like living props, part of the picturesque scenery. Years of suppressed rage suddenly erupted in her chest. Every day she watched students look through her father as if he didn't exist. Every day she bit her tongue when professors made casual comments about the help. Every day she swallowed her pride and pretended it didn't hurt when people assumed she didn't belong in their world. But today was different. Today, something inside her snapped, like a wire stretched too tight. Sarah changed direction and marched straight toward the photographer. Her heart pounded as fury coursed through her veins. She'd spent years being invisible, being polite, being grateful for scraps of opportunity. Not today. Today, she was going to make herself heard. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, years of frustration, embarrassment, and protective love for her father. She told this stranger exactly what she thought of his privileged perspective, his casual dismissal of working people, his tourist attitude toward her father's dignity. Students stopped to stare as Sarah's voice rose, but she didn't care. She was tired of being invisible, tired of watching her father be treated like furniture. If this was going to get her in trouble, if this was going to cost her everything she'd worked for, at least she would go down fighting. The photographer's reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of anger or dismissal, his face showed something that looked almost like respect. When she finished her tirade, breathing hard and shaking with adrenaline, he simply said he was sorry. Then he did something that completely threw her off balance. He walked over to her father and actually talked to him person to person. Sarah had to get to class, But as she hurried away, her mind was reeling. The confrontation had felt good in the moment, but now reality was setting in. She just screamed at a complete stranger in front of half the student body. Word would get around. It always did. What she didn't know was that this moment of authentic fury had been captured on camera. She didn't know that the man she'd confronted was about to become the most important person in her life. She had no idea that her decision to stand up for her father would soon open doors she'd never dreamed possible, and she definitely couldn't have imagined that within 24 hours her phone would ring with an offer that would change everything. She thought she knew about her future. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor. Sometimes the people we judge harshest turn out to be exactly what we need. Sometimes a single moment of standing up for what's right can reshape the entire trajectory of our lives. Sarah was about to learn that the world is full of surprises, and that sometimes the most unlikely encounters lead to the most extraordinary opportunities. But first, she had to survive the aftermath of her anger and decide whether she was brave enough to take the biggest risk of her life. The girl who'd always tried to stay invisible was about to discover what happened when she finally made herself seen. Sarah made it to class with 30 seconds to spare. She slipped into her usual seat in the back row, heart still racing from the confrontation. Professor Williams droned on about symbolism in modern literature, but Sarah's mind kept drifting, back to the photographer's face. The way he'd looked at her wasn't what she expected. There was no anger, no dismissal, just something that looked almost like understanding. She shook her head. Rich people were masters of pretending to care. It was probably just another performance. After class, Sarah headed to her job at the campus coffee shop. She needed the money desperately, and her shift supervisor had already warned her about missing too many hours. Between classes and work, she barely had time to breathe, let alone process what had happened that morning. The coffee shop buzzed with students who could afford $5 lattes without thinking twice. Sarah mechanically took orders, made drinks, and cleaned tables while her mind wandered. She wondered if the photographer was still on campus, if he'd complained to security about the scholarship student who'd humiliated him in public. Around 3 o'clock, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Sarah's stomach clenched as she answered. The voice on the other end belonged to the photographer. David Chen, he called himself. But instead of the angry complaint she expected, he asked to meet her after work. He claimed he had something that could help her family. Sarah's first instinct was to hang up. She didn't need charity from guilty rich people trying to ease their conscience. But something in his voice made her pause. There was no condescension, no pity, just a strange kind of respect that she'd never heard directed at her before. Against every rational thought in her head, she agreed to meet him at Mel's Diner on Broadway. It was a place she knew well, where she and her father sometimes grabbed dinner when they both worked late shifts. If this was some kind of trap, at least it would be on familiar ground. Her father Miguel insisted on coming along. Years of invisible labor had taught him to be suspicious of sudden kindness from strangers, especially wealthy ones. They'd faced disappointment too many times to trust easily. They arrived at Mel's to find David already waiting. Sarah studied his face as they sat. Down. He looked tired, older than he had that morning. The polished exterior seemed worn down, revealing something more genuine underneath. What happened next shattered every assumption Sarah had built about this man. David wasn't just a tourist with an expensive camera. He was a casting director, and he'd been scouting locations for a new film project. The photos he'd been taking weren't for some gallery showing or personal collection. They were research for a movie about social inequality, about the invisible people who keep society running. When Sarah had confronted him, when she'd defended her father with such raw passion, David had seen something he'd been searching for. Her anger wasn't just justified, it was powerful. It was the kind of authentic emotion that audiences connected with, the kind that couldn't be taught or faked. He showed them a photo he'd taken during the confrontation. Sarah stared at her own face, blazing with righteous fury, finger pointed directly at the camera. She barely recognized herself. In that moment, she looked fearless, unbreakable. David explained that he wanted to screen test her for a role in his film. The character was a young woman from a working-class family who fought for justice. It wasn't the lead role, but it was significant. And it paid more money than her father made in an entire year. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The man she'd screamed at, the privileged tourist she'd assumed represented everything wrong with society, had just offered her a chance to change her life forever. But the offer came with a terrible weight of possibility. Sarah had never acted before. She'd never even been in a school play. Her experience with performance was limited to the daily act of pretending she belonged in spaces where she was barely tolerated. What if her one moment of authentic anger couldn't translate into actual performance? What if this was all an elaborate joke, a way for wealthy people to laugh at the poor girl who thought she could be more than her circumstances? David left them with a business card and 24 hours to decide. As Sarah walked home with her father, her mind raced with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The card felt heavy in her pocket, like it contained either her salvation or her destruction. That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her father moving around in the kitchen, probably unable to sleep either. The weight of the decision pressed down on her chest like a physical thing. This opportunity felt too good to be true. In Sarah's experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. But what if this time was different? What if her moment of standing up for her family had actually opened a door instead of slamming one shut? She thought about all the times she'd bitten her tongue, swallowed her pride, made herself smaller to fit into spaces that didn't want her. She thought about her father's worn hands and bent back, the sacrifices he'd made so she could have opportunities he'd never dreamed of. Maybe it was time to stop making herself smaller. Maybe it was time to take up the space she'd been denying herself. By morning, Sarah had made her decision. She would call David Chen and agree to the screen test, not because she believed she could be an actress, but because she was tired of letting fear make her choices for her. She had no idea that this decision would launch her into a world she'd never imagined, full of people who would try to change her, use her, and ultimately help her discover who she really was. The girl who'd yelled at a stranger to defend her father was about to become someone entirely new. Whether that transformation would save her or destroy her remained to be seen. The next morning, Sarah stared at David Chen's business card for the 100th time. The edges were already worn from her nervous handling, but the words remained the same. Casting director. The logo of a production company she'd seen in movie. Credits. A phone number that could change everything. Her father had left for his early shift at the university, moving quietly through their small apartment so he wouldn't wake her. But Sarah had been awake for hours, wrestling with a decision that felt impossibly huge. In 12 hours, she would have to call David and give him an answer that would either launch her into an unknown future or leave her wondering what if for the rest of her life. The apartment felt smaller than usual that morning. Sarah looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. This was her reality, not the glamorous world of movies and red carpets that seemed as distant as another planet. What business did a girl like her have even dreaming about such things? But then she remembered the look in David's eyes when he'd shown her that photograph, the way he'd spoken about authentic emotion, about finding someone who could bring truth to a role. He hadn't been patronizing or condescending. He'd been genuinely excited, like he'd discovered something valuable. Sarah spent the morning researching everything she could find about David Chen online. His credits were impressive. Independent films that had won awards, studio projects that had made millions. He wasn't some amateur filmmaker looking for cheap labor. He was the real deal, which made his offer even more surreal. By noon, Sarah had made her decision. She would say yes to the screen test, not because she believed she had any talent, but because she was tired of letting fear make her choices. Her entire life had been shaped by playing it safe, by staying in her lane, by never reaching for anything. That seemed too good for someone like her. The phone call lasted less than 5 minutes. David's assistant scheduled her for a screen test the following Saturday. They would provide the script pages, the location, everything she needed. All Sarah had to do was show up and be herself. After hanging up, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that made her hands shake. She just committed to something completely outside her experience, something that could either elevate her family or become the most embarrassing mistake of her life. The week that followed was torture. Sarah went through the motions of her regular routine, classes, work, studying, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself analyzing every conversation, every gesture, wondering if this was what acting felt like. She watched movies differently, now paying attention to how actors delivered lines, how they expressed emotion. Her co-workers at the coffee shop noticed her distraction. Her professors commented on her lack of focus in class, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell anyone what was happening. The opportunity felt too fragile, too unreal to share with others who might puncture it with their skepticism. Friday night, Sarah barely slept. She lay in bed rehearsing introductions, imagining how the screen test might go, picturing a dozen different ways it could go wrong. What if she froze up? What if her voice cracked? What if David realized he'd made a terrible mistake? Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Sarah's mood. She dressed carefully in her best clothes, a simple black dress her mother had bought her for high school graduation, paired with shoes that were comfortable enough for standing but nice enough to look professional. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked older, more serious, like someone who might actually belong in the world she was about to enter. The casting studio was in Manhattan, in a building that looked like a converted warehouse. Sarah climbed 3 flights of stairs, her heart pounding harder with each step. The waiting room was sparse but professional, with framed movie posters on the walls and a receptionist who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Other actors were already waiting. Sarah felt immediately out of place among them. They had the polished look of people who belonged in this world. Perfect hair, expensive clothes, the kind of confidence that came from years of auditions and rejections, and small victories. They chatted casually about agents and callbacks and projects Sarah had never heard of. When her name was called, Sarah's legs felt like water. She followed a production assistant down a hallway lined with more movie posters, each one a reminder of how far she was from her comfort zone. The screen test room was smaller than she'd expected, with professional lighting equipment and a camera that seemed to stare at her like a giant mechanical eye. David was there, along with 2 other people she didn't recognize. They were kind enough, explaining the process and putting her at ease as much as possible. The scene they'd chosen was perfect for her, a monologue about a young woman defending her family's honor against someone who looked down on them. It was her confrontation at the fountain, translated into fictional dialogue. But when the camera started rolling, something unexpected happened. Sarah forgot about her nervousness, forgot about the equipment and the strangers watching her. She thought about her father's calloused hands, about all the times she'd watched him be invisible to people who should have seen his worth. She thought about years of biting her tongue and making herself smaller. The anger that had driven her to confront David in the first place came flooding back. But this time it was controlled, channeled into the character's words. For 3 minutes, Sarah wasn't a nervous college student pretending to be an actress. She was someone fighting for her family's dignity, someone who refused to be invisible any longer. When she finished, the room was silent. Sarah's heart sank, certain she'd done something wrong. But then David smiled, and she saw that same look of recognition she'd seen at the diner. He'd found what he was looking for, and somehow, impossibly, it was her. The next few minutes passed in a blur of congratulations and explanations. There would be contracts to sign, schedules to coordinate, a whole new world to navigate. But all Sarah could think about was the moment when she'd stopped pretending to be someone else and simply been herself, with all her anger and passion and protective love. Walking out of that building, Sarah felt like a different person than the one who'd walked in. Not because she was suddenly an actress, but because she'd finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. She'd spent years trying to fit into places that didn't want her, but maybe it was time to create her own place instead. 3 months later, Sarah stood on a movie set for the first time, watching a world she'd never imagined come to life around her. The film, titled Invisible Hands, was being shot in locations across New York City, each one chosen to highlight the stories of working people who kept society running while remaining largely unseen. The transformation in Sarah's life had been swift and overwhelming. The contracts were signed, the filming schedule arranged around her class schedule, and suddenly she found herself part of a world that had seemed as distant as space just weeks before. But the most profound change wasn't in her circumstances. It was in how she saw herself. The character she played was named Maria, a hotel housekeeper's daughter who fought against a system designed to keep her family invisible. The parallels to her own life were undeniable. But playing Maria taught Sarah something unexpected about the power of her own story. What she'd always seen as sources of shame, her father's job, their financial struggles, her outsider status, at Columbia, were actually her greatest strengths as a performer. David had been right about authentic emotion. While other actors in the film had to reach deep to find the feelings their characters required, Sarah simply had to remember. Remember the sting of being overlooked, the weight of carrying her family's hopes, the fire that burned in her chest when she saw injustice. Every scene came from a place of lived experience that couldn't be taught or faked. The crew, initially skeptical of the inexperienced girl who'd landed a significant role through what seemed like luck, gradually developed genuine respect for her work. Sarah brought something raw and real to every take, something that elevated the performances of the seasoned actors around her. She wasn't just playing a character, she was channeling every working-class daughter who'd ever felt invisible, every young person who'd been told to stay in their lane. Her father visited the set once, during a weekend shoot in Brooklyn. Miguel stood quietly in the background, watching his daughter deliver lines with the same fierce protectiveness she'd shown that morning at the fountain. When the director called cut, Miguel's eyes were wet with tears he tried to hide. This was his daughter, the girl he'd worked double shifts to put through school, now commanding attention and respect in a room full of professionals. The film wrapped on a cold December morning, and Sarah felt a strange mixture of accomplishment and loss. For months, she'd been living between two worlds, her regular life as a college student and worker, and this temporary identity as an actress. Now she had to figure out which world she truly belonged to, or if there was a way to create something entirely new. The answer came sooner than expected. Before the film even finished post-production, Sarah started receiving calls from other casting directors who'd heard about her performance. David had shared her screen test with colleagues, and word was spreading about the untrained actress who brought devastating authenticity to her roles. Offers began coming in, small parts, but legitimate opportunities in real productions. Sarah found herself at another crossroads. She could return to her original plan, finish college, find a safe job, and treat her brief acting experience as an interesting detour. Or she could lean into this unexpected path, despite having no formal training and no connections in the industry beyond David's initial faith in her. The decision became clear when Invisible Hands premiered at a film festival in early spring. Sarah attended with her parents, wearing a borrowed dress and shoes she'd practiced walking in for hours. Seeing her performance on a big screen, surrounded by an audience that laughed and gasped and wiped away tears at the right moments, was surreal beyond description. But the moment that changed everything came during the Q&A session after the screening. A young Latina woman in the audience stood up and thanked Sarah for her portrayal of Maria. She said seeing someone who looked like her, who came from similar circumstances, fighting for dignity on screen, had made her feel less alone in her own struggles. Other audience members nodded in agreement, sharing their own stories of feeling invisible in a world that often overlooked working people. That night, Sarah understood something fundamental about the power of storytelling. Her anger that morning at Columbia hadn't just been about defending her father. It had been about demanding to be seen, to have her family's humanity acknowledged. Now, through her performances, she could amplify voices like hers, tell stories that needed telling, make space for people who'd been pushed to the margins. The girl who'd yelled at a stranger to protect her father's dignity had become someone who could protect the dignity of countless others through her work. It wasn't the path she'd planned, but it was the path that chose her, born from a moment of authentic fury that revealed who she really was underneath all her attempts to fit in. Sarah decided to defer her final year of college and pursue acting full-time. The decision terrified her parents initially, but they'd seen the change in their daughter, the confidence, the sense of purpose, the way she carried herself like someone who finally knew her own worth. Miguel, who'd spent years making himself invisible so others could shine, watched his daughter step fully into the light. Years later, when Sarah won her first major award for a performance about immigration and working-class dignity, she would think back to that cold Tuesday morning when everything changed. In her acceptance speech, she would talk about the importance of authentic anger, of standing up for the people we love, of refusing to be invisible in a world that prefers we stay quiet. But that night was still in the future. For now, Sarah was simply a young woman who'd discovered that sometimes the universe rewards us not for playing it safe, but for having the courage to be exactly who we are, even when that means making noise in places that prefer silence. The janitor's daughter had found her voice, and she was never going to let anyone make her invisible again. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most extraordinary transformations. Sometimes a single moment of standing up for what's right can reshape not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone who needs to hear our story. Sarah's story was just beginning, but it had started exactly where it needed to, with love, anger, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves to be seen. 5 years after that life-changing confrontation at Columbia University, Sarah Martinez stood in her father's old janitor closet, now converted into a production office. The irony wasn't lost on her. The space where Miguel had once stored, cleaning supplies and taken his brief breaks, now housed scripts, call sheets, and planning documents for Sarah's own production company. The journey from that angry college student to successful actress and now producer had been anything but smooth. Success in Hollywood, Sarah learned, came with its own unique set of challenges that no one had prepared her for. The industry that had embraced her authenticity also tried relentlessly to change her, to sand down the rough edges that made her performances so compelling. Early in her career, agents suggested she lighten her accent, lose weight, play up her exotic appeal for certain roles while downplaying her working-class background for others. Casting directors loved her raw emotion, but wanted her to be more palatable, more marketable. The same fire that had launched her career became something they wanted to control and package. Sarah had fired 3 different agents before finding one who understood that her authenticity wasn't a flaw to be fixed, but a strength to be protected. She learned to navigate an industry built on image and connections while staying true to the values her father had instilled in her. It was a constant balancing act that required saying no to lucrative opportunities that felt wrong and yes to smaller projects that meant something deeper. The turning point came during her 3rd year in the industry when she was offered a role in a major studio film about immigration. The character was supposedly based on real experiences, but the script was filled with stereotypes and trauma porn designed to make wealthy audiences feel good about their compassion. Sarah read it and felt sick. This wasn't storytelling. It was exploitation wrapped in social consciousness. She turned down the role, despite her team's protests about the career opportunities she was sacrificing. Instead, she started writing her own script, drawing from her father's stories and the experiences of other invisible workers she'd grown up around. The project became Night Shift Chronicles, an anthology series that would eventually air on a streaming platform and earn critical acclaim for its honest portrayal of working-class immigrant experiences. But success brought unexpected isolation. Sarah's old friends at Columbia didn't know how to relate to her anymore, and her new industry colleagues often saw her as a curiosity rather than an equal. She was too famous for her old world and too authentic for her new one. The girl who'd spent years feeling invisible now felt seen by millions, but understood by few. The loneliness was most acute when she won her first Emmy for Night Shift Chronicles. Standing on that stage, holding the golden statue, Sarah thought about her father watching from their old apartment. Miguel had refused to attend the ceremony, claiming he didn't belong in such fancy places. His absence from what should have been her greatest triumph highlighted the distant success had created between her and the people she'd fought so hard to represent. That night, after the parties and interviews, Sarah sat alone in her hotel room and made a decision that would define the next phase of her career. She would use her platform not just to tell authentic stories, but to create pathways for others like her to tell their own stories. The industry needed more voices from the margins, more people who understood invisibility because they'd lived it. Sarah established a foundation that provided scholarships and mentorship for aspiring filmmakers from working-class backgrounds. She used her production company to hire crew members from underrepresented communities, paying living wages and providing the kind of opportunities that had been denied to people like her father for generations. Each project became a chance to create the representation she'd needed as a young woman, unsure if someone like her belonged in professional spaces. The foundation's first scholarship recipient was Maria Santos, a janitor's daughter from Chicago, who'd been writing scripts in her spare time while working double shifts to support her family. When Maria's first short film premiered at Sundance, Sarah watched from the audience and felt the same pride she'd seen in her father's eyes years earlier. The cycle was beginning again, but this time with intentional support instead of accidental discovery. Not everyone appreciated Sarah's approach to using her success. Industry publications criticized her for being too political, for making everything about class and representation. Some former colleagues suggested she was limiting her artistic growth by focusing so narrowly on social issues. But Sarah remembered the young woman who'd felt invisible for so long, and she knew that visibility for people like her was inherently political. The real validation came from unexpected places. Miguel, now retired, started attending screenings of Sarah's films, sitting in the back row and watching his daughter's work bring audiences to tears. He never said much about her success, but Sarah would catch him showing newspaper clippings about her achievements to neighbors, his quiet pride evident in the careful way he handled the articles. On the 10th anniversary of Invisible Hands, Sarah organized a special screening at Columbia University. She stood in the same courtyard where she'd confronted David Chen, but now she was addressing a crowd of students, faculty, and community members who'd come to hear her story. The fountain looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. During the Q&A after the screening, a young man raised his hand. He introduced himself as the son of a cafeteria worker, currently on scholarship and struggling with feeling like he didn't belong. His voice cracked as he asked Sarah how she'd learned to trust her own voice when everyone around her seemed more qualified, more polished, more deserving of success. Sarah looked at him and saw herself a decade earlier, the fear, the imposter syndrome, the desperate hunger for validation and belonging. But she also saw something she'd forgotten she once possessed, the raw hunger to prove that voices like theirs mattered, that their stories deserved to be heard. Her answer was simple but hard-earned. She told him that authenticity wasn't about being perfect or polished. It was about being honest, even when that honesty made others uncomfortable. It was about refusing to apologize for taking up space, for having opinions, for demanding better treatment for the people who raised you. Most importantly, it was about understanding that your difference isn't a flaw to overcome, but a strength to cultivate. After the event, Sarah walked across campus alone, retracing the path she'd taken that morning when everything changed. The students hurrying past looked just like she had, focused, worried, carrying the weight of dreams that felt both essential and impossible. But now she knew something she hadn't known then. Sometimes the moments that feel like endings are actually beginnings in disguise. The girl who'd yelled at a stranger to defend her father's dignity had become a woman who spent her career defending dignity for people who'd never expected to have their stories told. It wasn't the path she'd planned, but it was the path that had chosen her, born from authentic anger and sustained by purposeful love. Sarah's story had become bigger than just her own success. It had become a bridge between worlds, a proof of concept that authentic voices could not only survive in spaces that didn't initially welcome them, but could transform those spaces entirely. The janitor's daughter had not just found her voice, she'd created space for others to find theirs, too.